As matcha's popularity has skyrocketed recently, so has the amount of misinformation that you can find about it on the internet. So today I'll take a look at the most common myths and misconceptions I see spread around the internet about matcha, and I'll see if there's any truth to any of them. First up, myth number 1. You should buy ceremonial grade matcha. I've talked about the term ceremonial grade on this channel many times. In fact, I've made an entire video about it, but here's the basics. You might see the word ceremonial grade slapped on lots of different matcha brands, but the fact is, this really isn't a regulated term. Say 10 to 20 years ago, when matcha was first being introduced to countries outside of Japan, the term ceremonial grade might have been a useful way to distinguish drinkable tea from matcha that was either made for culinary processing or even grown outside of Japan. However, these days, when anyone can slap the word ceremonial grade onto anything and higher quality matcha is easier to buy outside of Japan than it ever was before, this term is almost like a red flag, because if someone uses it, you might be paying more for a matcha than you should, because they can take any low quality tea and just call it ceremonial grade. In Japan, the term ceremonial grade really isn't used at all, and it's definitely not used by people who actually practice the Japanese tea ceremony. If you want to see a deeper dive into this term and learn about the different ways that matcha quality is actually graded and separated in Japan, you can see my full-length video on it over here. So the verdict here is false. You shouldn't necessarily buy matcha labeled ceremonial grade because the term is meaningless. Myth number 2. Greener is always better. This one generally holds true. The greener matcha is, the higher quality it tends to be, especially if you're comparing teas from the sort of processing culinary end of the spectrum to usucha or koicha grade teas. But once you get into the realm of really high quality teas, it becomes a little more nuanced. The vibrancy of the green color of a matcha comes from a few factors, some of which being the cultivar the matcha was made from and the way it was shaded. Some cultivars are inherently darker and more vibrant than others. For example, okumidori is a dark green in the leaves already, even before it's been shaded. Compare that to asahi, which is generally considered to be a higher quality cultivar, but has lighter colored leaves. So the resulting matcha powder is going to be lighter in color compared to the okumidori. On top of this, the shading method can also affect the color of the leaves. This okumidori matcha, Kanoyama, was made using the direct shading method, where the shading fabric is put directly on top of the tea plants, and it has a very dark green color. Whereas this okumidori matcha, umezuki, was made using the shelf style of shading, where a canopy is erected over the tea plants and the shading fabric is put on top of that. This is generally considered to be a higher quality style of shading that produces better tasting tea, but the resulting matcha is actually of a lighter color. So using the greenness alone is not an effective way to judge the quality of these two teas. In fact, the highest quality shading method, honzu, which is a shelf style shading that uses straw instead of synthetic shading fabric, actually produces an even lighter color than the synthetic fabric, and is also considered to be a higher quality style, but produces tea of a lighter color. So for the verdict of this myth that greener is always better, it generally holds true, but there's more to this story, so mostly true. Myth number 3, organic is better. This one's a little complicated as there are a lot of different factors that go into organic matcha, so let's break it down a little bit. Generally speaking, organic farming is going to be easier on the environment due to the lack of pesticides and the lack of chemical fertilizer. But you can do both of those things without being certified organic. Organic certification by the Japanese government or the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture is a long, involved, and expensive process. Not only does your farm have to be organically certified, but the farms that surround you also have to be organically certified because of runoffs and the risk of cross-contamination. So a lot of small tea farmers that might grow things naturally or use organic fertilizers or don't use pesticides aren't able to obtain this organic certification even if their teas are grown more or less organically. In fact, it's mostly larger corporations that sell organic matcha, and this is not to say that large tea companies can't produce high quality matcha, but the majority of the really tasty matcha comes from these smaller tea farms. When it comes to quality and taste, That's a little bit subjective, but generally speaking, the modern image of matcha as being vibrant, green, and incredibly umami comes from the amount of fertilizers that are put into the plant. And if you're using exclusively organic fertilizers, it's hard to get that same effect. So generally speaking, organically grown matcha tends to be a little more bitter, a little less umami, and a little less vibrant. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule. In fact, the most famous tencha grower in Japan, Tsuji-san, exclusively uses high-quality fish imported from Hokkaido to fertilize his plants, and he doesn't use any pesticides. But his teas aren't certified organic, even though they're grown in an organic manner using organic fertilizer. You can see there's a lot of nuances here. Additionally, price comes into play here because getting your organic certification is expensive, and often this organic label is applied to low quality teas as a way to increase its price. So often with organic matchas, you're actually paying more for the same quality or even lower quality of tea. So the verdict here is organic matcha always better? Not quite, it's complicated, but generally speaking, not really. Myth number 4. Matcha is always bitter. Is it? No, this one isn't, but some matchas are bitter, and in fact, when you're making matcha to be blended into cookies or lattes or smoothies, bitterness is actually a desirable flavor compound because that helps the tea cut through the sugar or milk or whatever else is in the drink or food. But when it comes to making teas for drinking straight, as usucha or as koicha, generally speaking, bitterness is not desirable, and so the producers make tea with little to no bitterness. Bitterness occurs in tea plants due to two compounds, caffeine and catechins. No one's quite sure why plants developed caffeine, but one prominent theory is that it is a natural pesticide or pest repellent because of its bitter taste. Tea plants produce more caffeine during the summer, warmer months when there are more insects. So if teas are picked earlier in the year, say in spring, they tend to have a little less caffeine, and therefore are a little less bitter. Catechins, the second main bitter tasting compound, are thought to exist primarily as a sort of UV sunscreen for the tea plants. So by shading the tea before picking it, as is done with matcha, the tea does not have to produce as many catechins because there's less sunlight to protect itself against. So instead, these catechins are broken down and turned into different sort of aromatic compounds, which give shaded teas their distinct aroma. Also, under shading, the tea plant produces more amino acids, and these are the sweet and savory umami compounds that matcha is famous for. Among these, the most important being L-theanine. So with the right fertilizer, picking, and shading, the highest quality matchas actually have little to no bitterness whatsoever. So the verdict here is matcha always bitter? Obviously not. Myth number 5. Matcha is simply green tea powder. This one's a little bit like squares and rectangles. Yes, matcha is a powdered green tea, but not all powdered green teas are matcha. The reason why is that matcha is powdered in a specific way, and it is from a specific green tea. First up, the green tea part. Matcha is made from tencha, and tencha is a very special type of green tea. As I just mentioned, tencha is shaded. Shading helps decrease the bitterness and increase the umami and sweetness in a tea, and also helps bring out these unique aromatic compounds that wouldn't exist otherwise. On top of this, the processing of tencha is designed to make it easy to grind. The leaves are first steamed, which locks in the freshness and special aromatic compounds before being dried and deveined. The veins that run down the middle of a tea leaf are difficult to grind, so they must be removed so that only the leaf meat, as it is called, is left behind, and this is what is put into the grinder. Speaking of the grinder, matcha is traditionally ground using a stone mill or an ichiusu. These mills are specially designed to grind matcha without heating it up too much, as heating up the tea while grinding it will cause the quality to deteriorate. Generic green tea powder isn't made using a stone mill, but rather something more large-scale and commercial, such as a steel mill or a jet mill or a ball mill or a bead mill. These industrial mills produce tea at a much higher volume, but generally at a reduced quality, and often can heat up the leaves during grinding or produce particles of an inconsistent size. While occasionally some of these commercial mills, especially bead mills, can be fine-tuned to produce higher quality teas, they still generally aren't as good as the traditional stone mills. And these teas aren't shaded or deveined, so the resulting powder is going to be more bitter and less umami. So while matcha is in fact a green tea that is powdered, it is not the same as generic green tea powder. The verdict is matcha green tea powder, technically true, but false in spirit. Myth number 6. You need fancy equipment to make matcha. Well, I've got some fancy equipment here, but you don't really need all of this to make a good bowl of matcha. All you really need is a whisk, some tea, and a bowl. The fanciness is up to you. And just like that, I've got a perfect bowl of matcha in a cereal bowl. Outside of fancy traditional teaware, you might also see people using high-tech machinery to make matcha at home, and you definitely don't need that either. Matcha's been around for over 800 years, and they didn't have fancy machinery back then, so you definitely don't need it either. But if you do want to use some fancier teaware, because it is aesthetically pleasing and lovely to use, we have a lot of it available in our store. So the verdict for this myth: you need fancy equipment to make matcha? Obviously not, this one's false. Myth number 7. You need to have lots of foam on your matcha. While super microfoamy frothy matcha might be incredibly aesthetically appealing, you'll see it plastered all over Instagram, that's not the only way to make matcha. And you certainly don't need all of that foam. The super foamy style of matcha that you'll see everywhere is called usucha, and specifically it is the style of usucha that is made by the Urasenke school of tea, the largest school of Japanese tea ceremony. While it is true that the ability to produce a fine foam is indicative of a high quality matcha, you don't actually have to make this foam to enjoy the tea. Before Urasenke became the largest school, a different school, Omotesenke, was the biggest, and their usucha has almost no foam on it. So both of these are equally valid ways to make matcha. With that in mind, it's good to note that the foam has a pronounced effect on the flavor of the usucha. Usucha with less foam tends to be a little stronger in flavor with a more powerful aroma, whereas producing foam tends to round out the flavor, making it softer and more mellow. Of course, there's also a textural component to it, so at the end of the day, it's really personal preference, and I tend to make matcha that has foam somewhere in the middle. For a deeper dive on the effects of foam on the flavor of matcha, you can check out my video on it over here. Of course, in the most formal and intense way of drinking matcha, koicha, or thick tea, there is no foam whatsoever. Instead, the tea is kneaded into a thick paste, which brings out even more of its sweetness and umami and subtle complexities and flavors. It's truly a completely different way to experience matcha, and it's one that I really recommend you try. So, does your matcha have to be foamy? Of course not. It's entirely up to you. Myth number 8. Single origin matcha is higher quality than blended matcha. In recent years, the trends of single origin or farm-to-table or direct sourcing have become incredibly popular in industries such as wine and coffee, and also tea and matcha. That being said, this is really just a style of tea rather than a marker of quality. All that single origin means is that the tea comes from one producer and often from one cultivar or type of tea plant. This has no bearing on the quality of the tea. You can have high quality single origin tea or low quality single origin tea. The important part is that it is a direct expression of the tea plant and of the farmer's style and processing. The same can be said for blended matcha. This is simply a style of matcha. In this case, the producers will blend tea from various farms or various parts of Japan to produce a tea that tastes a certain way or has a certain price point or looks a certain way. Like with single origin matcha, this can span a wide spectrum of quality. Some blended matchas are incredibly low quality and incredibly cheap, as they're designed to go into baked goods, And some blends win awards or are gifted to the emperor because they are of the highest quality and are used in super formal high-end tea ceremonies. Blended matcha is generally seen as the more traditional style, as this has been the de facto practice for over 400 years. Blending allows the producers to even out any of the imperfections in a single tea. You can blend tencha that has an amazing aroma with tencha that has a fantastic taste, with tencha that has an incredibly vibrant color to produce a more rounded and balanced final product. In contrast, single origin matcha is much more transparent, so the skills and style of the farmer is more directly on display. So at the end of the day, this is more of a style preference than one of quality. Both single origin teas and blended teas have a huge range of quality. Both of them can be incredibly tasty. So the verdict here is single origin always better than blended? Obviously not, this one is false. That rounds out my collection of the most common matcha myths and misconceptions. If you have any more, please let me know in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and if you want to see more educational tea content like this, make sure to subscribe because I will be making more of it. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you had a nice bowl of tea to drink while I talked about tea.